Is capital punishment inhumane? In the classes that I've been teaching this last few weeks in ethics, I've had a number of students take up the challenge of writing on this issue of the death penalty. We can have plenty of conversation about the issue of whether or not it's administered well, whether or not it's administered well enough. I'm perfectly willing to concede that there have been cases where people either were put to death or were going to be put to death until last-minute evidence showed up and rescued them. And for that rescue, I'm very grateful. That said, that's really not the issue. The issue is it inhumane? Is it wrong? Is it a mistreatment of the person who's put to death when we practice capital punishment? Well, I remember as a young man listening to my father talk about this, and he had this way of kind of laying out the perspective held by those he disagreed with and seeking every point of agreement that he could find, and then turning around and explaining the differences. And I remember him talking about the horror of putting someone to death as a perfectly appropriate sort of starting point for answering the question. He would say, look, anybody who's comfortable with this, anybody who's eager for this, probably needs to check their spirit. That's not a healthy perspective at all. It is gruesome and it is ugly when we put someone to death. And he emphasized that over and over again. And again, I get that sympathy and that recognition of the humanity of the one being put to death. But having laid all that out, my father then turned and said, the reason the death penalty is appropriate and fitting and not in the least bit inhumane with respect to those who are guilty of first-degree murder is because of the gruesomeness and heinousness of first-degree murder. On the one hand, those who stand opposed to the death penalty will say, well, how can you how can you support the death penalty when the death penalty is for killing someone? Isn't that hypocritical? Well, I would take the position, and my father would as well, that you're looking at it inside out. That when we don't give this most shocking, grievous, dark, scary, hard punishment for the murdering of human beings, we're actually diminishing the value of human beings. We're saying that the worth or the value of a human being is a lifetime in prison. Remember, friends, when God enjoined the people of Israel and giving them the law, first of all, he did give them capital punishment. That ought to settle it for any Christian right then and there. When God established a government, as he did in Old Testament Israel, he told that government, when it comes to first-degree murder, people who commit this, they need to be put to death by you. Okay? They can be forgiven by God, of course. They can end up spending eternity in heaven, of course. But the calling of the state is to execute the murderer. Secondly, I want you to understand that not only has God done this, but he's established this principle in the Old Testament that we call the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And we look at that and think, oh, how barbaric, how terrible. Well, the whole point of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is that the punishment needs to fit the crime. You don't have a punishment that is too soft and too light, and you don't have a punishment that is too severe. They need to match, which is precisely what the death penalty does and what life in prison does not do. So inhumane is not something I'm willing to affirm. I am willing, again, to consider whether or not we have sufficient safeguards, whether or not there's this issue or that issue with it in how it's being put to practice. But in principle, God has established, even before the formation of Israel. I understand we're not the nation of Israel, but when God spoke to Noah, who is the father of us all, wherever we may be, He gave the same principle. If a man sheds a man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. God is not inhumane.